Welcome to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanassis Cambanis, and today I'm joined by my friend Mohamad Bazzi, who's the director of the Hagop Kevorkian Center at New York University. But more importantly, for the purposes of this podcast, he is a longtime journalist and author who's written about Lebanon, which is where his family is from. Mohamad, thank you so much for coming on Order from Ashes.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be with you.
Well, you wrote this very powerful and moving essay in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago called "Is This What War Looks Like Now?" And I will let you unspool for our readers, our listeners rather, what you wrote about in that essay. Uh, so I want to use that as the starting point. What is it you're writing about here, and what is different about the way war is now in Lebanon compared to the way war has been in a country that's been at war on and off, uh, if not constantly, very cyclically for half a century?
Yeah, thanks. You know, I tried to get at this idea of how Gaza represents this new pinnacle of this type of wholesale destruction as military strategy, um, and how what our world has changed into over the past 2.5 years, since October 2023, and since Israel set in motion after the Hamas attacks, since Israel set in motion this machinery of genocide, and that's been enabled by U.S. support, and impunity and denial in much of the West about what Israel has done to Gaza, and now what it's doing to Lebanon, using the similar playbook. We're seeing Israel repeating this playbook in the war on Lebanon, intense aerial bombardment, um, mass evacuation orders, which are illegal under international law, that lead to this large-scale displacement of civilians, um, the targeting and destruction of civilian infrastructure, now the wholesale razing of border towns and villages in southern Lebanon, including my own hometown, Bint Jbail, which you're very familiar with, um, and the targeting of hospitals, of healthcare workers, the killing of journalists. And as this has been unfolding in Lebanon over the past few weeks, or really since early March, since the early days of the U.S.-Iran-Israel war, we're seeing indifference, and this
You mean
from in the
international
West. Yeah, and
international difference?
international. Yeah, we're seeing international indifference. We're seeing almost this um, callousness, this severe, much in the same way we saw about Gaza. We're seeing this callousness from the international community and this numbness to the scale and level of suffering of Lebanese civilians and the people of Lebanon,
Yeah,
as we saw in Gaza.
and I want to carefully keep in our conversation. I want to keep threading in the because this is what you did in your essay, I think so effectively. I want to thread in the personal experience of your extended family, which you use as a window into this wider phenomenon. And if we can, I want to talk on those two levels simultaneously because I do think that's part of why maybe people have lost hold of the thread of what's happening here because we are inured, especially in the United States, after a quarter of a century of hearing about forever wars, to understanding like what is new and worse and different about Gaza 2024 or Lebanon 2026 when we've been hearing about and seeing about these wholesale cycles of destruction. And I think you can help us understand or help our listeners understand, yes, it's always been bad and these things have happened over and over that have been terrible, but something new and different is is at play in this kind of warfare. And if we can, I want us to try and pinpoint in that conversation like what it is about. I mean, so Bint Jbail has been destroyed many times in my adult lifetime since I heard of it 20 years ago. You've known about it your whole life because your family's from there. Presumably it's been destroyed many times before. Something is different about what's happening there now. It might look the same to a casual observer. What's the difference?
Yeah, it's a great question, Thanassi. I think the difference is the level of destruction and the level of hopelessness that I think I'm hearing from people for the time that talking to my extended family over the past few weeks, um, the sense of despair, I've never heard this before in my adult life and when also in my childhood. And there's been five, I lose track, but I think there's been five Israeli invasions in my lifetime of Bint Jbail starting in
What year were you
1978.
born?
I was born in 1975, and the
Wow,
first invasion, yes,
so you're exactly as old as the many cycles of Israeli invasions of Lebanon.
yes, and actually, I was born, near Bint Jbail in a hospital near Bint Jbail and taken Bint Jbail because my family was staying in Bint Jbail in those early months. I was born in late 1975 in late October. The civil war had started, and my family was taking refuge with our relatives in our grandparents' home in Bint Jbail,
So
and
that
we
was
did that.
a safe place
Yes,
of
at
refuge
that
at
point.
that time.
It was, yes, because I mean, even though there had been some cross-border confrontations between the PLO and Israel at that point, it was safer than Beirut. It was safer than parts of Beirut we were living in, and so we took refuge there. And then until about 1976, kind of returned to Beirut. And but the first Israeli invasion of my hometown was in 1978. And that was the beginning of Israel's attempt to establish this what is called the security zone, security belt in southern Lebanon. The first attempt at forming this proxy militia, the South Lebanon Army, the SLA, then followed by the much wider Israeli invasion in 1982, that where Israeli troops got all the way to Beirut and beyond. And we actually took refuge in Bint Jbail again in 1982 because it was safer than being in Beirut at the early parts of the invasion. Um, then followed by the war and an attempted invasion in 2006, which you're very familiar with from your
Yeah, we
time
spent some
reporting on the
time
ground.
together reporting
Yes,
during that war in
yes,
Lebanon.
so that was war. That was the third invasion, or yeah, that was the third invasion. And at that point, Israel didn't get to capture it. It really wanted to capture Bint Jbail, but it didn't. It didn't. The Israeli military wasn't able to capture it. Caused some tremendous destruction in 2006. Then again in 2024 was the next war and invasion, and now we have the latest invasion in 2026. I think what's different this time is the scale and this attempt that actually succeeded, where Israel was able to push all the residents out in 1978 and 1982. Uh, they didn't push everyone out. There were people, they were occupying territory in southern Lebanon and occupying the place and the people in it. And this time, the strategy has been to push everyone out, to clear these towns like Bint Jbail and other towns that are not under occupation, to clear them of their residents, and now to demolish the infrastructure entirely. And we're seeing reports of Israel bringing in civilian contractors, as they did in parts of Gaza, to demolish houses, to demolish schools, to demolish hospitals, in addition to bombing, dynamiting, and just to create a wasteland where people won't be able to go back and live. I think that's beginning to sink in um, into people's consciousness. I'm hearing it in conversations with relatives. The scale is something they haven't seen before. They haven't seen this level of destruction and this attempt to make their hometown, to make this village where some people have apartments in the Beirut suburbs, in the Dahi. I have some relatives who've lost homes both in Bint Jbail and in Dahi in the southern suburbs of Beirut. Um, so some people have places elsewhere, but and they've now been displaced twice. But the root, the sense of being connected to that town, and because of the social structure in Lebanon, and because you sort of when people ask you where you're from, you will say the town that you're from. My personal records, my uh, uh,
Your family book,
Sijil Madani, yeah, but
your
yeah, it is in Bint Jbail and has been all the time. Any time I've needed to do it, anytime I needed to
right. That's where
get a
you
Lebanese
vote.
ID
That's
card,
where you
that's
get
where
a birth
yes,
certificate. That's where you
exactly.
have to do your bureaucratic interface with the Lebanese state. It is, in other words, a functional part of your daily existence. It's not just a sentimental roots home of your roots.
exactly, and it's a great way of putting it. It's where you go to vote. That's where you're registered to vote. Even if I tried to, I mean, my family has lived in Beirut for a long time, in the Dahi and sort of other parts of Beirut, and and but they can't change that civil registry. They can't change that as the place where they would vote. So they're connected to it, both by choice and by necessity. And I think that feels different now. The other part that feels different is the scale of violence. So the scale of violence and destruction that Israel has unleashed, but also the scale, the sense that people have that there's nothing to restrain Israel. There's nothing to restrain this war machine right now. The U.S. won't do it. The Trump administration won't do it, and the West, Europe seems largely powerless and hasn't been able to do it. We've heard a little bit from France and other European states, but they haven't been able to have an impact on the ground and have any impact on Israel's actions and restraining Israel.
Yeah. I
So
mean,
that sense people is making people feel hopeless.
I want to linger on the intent and impact of this depopulation, ethnic cleansing, genocidal warfare, because it, I mean, that is, I think, the state difference between, so we have lots of experience in the last generation of total warfare, indiscriminate killing of civilians, targeting of clearly innocent people, and so on. And we also have, unfortunately, a lot of experience of, Western and other indifference to avoidable death that could have been stopped. However, uh, we don't have experience until after October 7th, 2023, with the kind of mass expulsion of a society, at least in these conflict zones. And I think it's really important to define and distinguish and locate that, because in the drumbeat of violence and displacement that we've seen over the last quarter century since the 9/11 wars started, it one again, a casual observer can be forgiven for not understanding how is this different from, say, the millions of Iraqis displaced after the U.S. invasion, or the various war crimes and large scale death that the U.S. participated in the Iraq invasion, or that Israel participated in the 2006 Lebanon war, the destruction of Mosul, and so on. There's many examples of things that look similar but aren't. And I think the big difference. So, I mean, I'm just thinking, actually the first place that I ever saw this level of destruction was Bint Jbail in 2006. And I remember, I'm not sure you were there that day of the sort of temporary ceasefire in the middle of the war at the
Mm.
end of July, but it was the first place I visited where I saw entire densely densely built urban neighborhoods reduced to rubble, and it was shocking. It's like shocked the conscience. I couldn't comprehend it, actually. Subsequently, I saw similar levels of destruction in Mosul and Raqqa and Homs. And actually, sorry, I didn't go to Raqqa, but physically, I visited Homs and suburbs of Damascus and Mosul, other places where I saw something like this, and it became a sort of hallmark of the age. However, in all those other cases, eventually people came back, right? And
Yes.
the point, I guess, in those cases was maybe the punishers who were doing that destruction wanted to send a message to one or another ethnic or political or sectarian community, but eventually those places were going to be re-inhabited by more or less the people who had lived there before. So this is something different. And what would you call it? Because I really don't want us to pick up this kind of genocidal vocabulary of security zone or buffer zone or clearance. I mean, we hear this language. How would you describe what's being done? And can you tell us in a little more detail what is being unmade in the physical infrastructure and societal infrastructure of border towns like Bint Jbail?
Yeah, that's a great question and a difficult one, because I think you're right. We don't want to pick up this vocabulary that we now see in daily usage. We see it in legacy media usage. We see it in coming out of politicians and a lot of policymakers. Um, so, and I think you hit at the heart of it, that that now the people who've been displaced, the people who've been forced out of their hometowns, their villages, their homes, are worried, and rightfully so, that they're never going to be able to go back. They're worried about a Nakba level of experience. They're worried that this is that this will be a Lebanese version of the Nakba, um, where and it's unclear whether will Israel try to physically maintain control um, of the border areas, with troops over that rubble. It may not be that. It may not look like that. It may not look like what's happening in Gaza under, in the so-called within the so-called yellow line. Of course, it's very interesting that the Israelis use the same descriptors, the kind of the yellow line concept that they've exported from Gaza into southern Lebanon, and of course it's always vague. It's always it's never, because the Israeli military needs to have this capability to expand it at will, which is what they've been doing just in the
Right. It
last few
seems like
weeks of the
the
ceasefire. Yeah,
boundary will be as much as they can get away
yeah,
with, right?
yes, yes, as much as they can get away with, and yeah, as much as the world will let them get away with. Never mind the Lebanese state, because it's been powerless to counteract this. So this sense, I think this is what's weighing most heavily on people. The sense that, and people have to. There's no one on the ground. There were some Hezbollah fighters, but I think most of the Hezbollah fighters, have been killed or pushed out even from that area, the towns now under Israeli occupation. And so there's not a lot of firsthand information coming out. So one way that people get their information is by looking at satellite photos. So there are a number of websites that, every day when I open Facebook, I see a whole bunch of very upsetting and demoralizing photos of new levels of destruction of Bint Jbail and the surrounding towns. And that's what people are doing. They're looking on these websites that share satellite footage. Some people are pooling resources. Dropsite News actually did a very good story on this. Some people pooling their resources to buy satellite footage so they can get more higher resolution photos. And they are looking at these photos to see if their home has been destroyed, their own home, their family home. Um, the generational home, and so that, think about that extra layer of tragedy, and
You can sit
heartbreak.
in an apartment in Beirut,
Mhm.
in a friend's apartment, and pay money to get a keyhole image of your house and find out that last week or the day before yesterday it was dynamited into
Exactly.
oblivion.
Yes, and you hear that heartbreak. One interesting, I want to jump off something you mentioned. Uh, that first ceasefire in late July 2006 in Bint Jbail. And it's interesting to be your reaction to the level of destruction is really interesting, because you had experienced Iraq in 2003, in 2004. You had been to, I mean,
3 years.
Mosul
For
had,
three
yeah,
years, I had
yes, you
lived
had been,
in
yeah,
war
and
and
seen
what I
that
thought was a
level.
catastrophe.
Yes, and you had seen that level of destruction, destruction caused largely by the U.S. military, but that didn't. I think the scale was
It
so was
paled.
so
It
different.
paled in
Exactly.
comparison to what I saw. Yes, and
Exactly.
and this and look, I don't know when the last time you had the misfortune or not misfortune, but the sad experience of visiting South Lebanon. I was there a year ago, so during I guess it was a ceasefire again.
Hmm.
And I was shocked. And this is after I've been sort of pushed beyond the ability to be shocked by things. So I went to Hiam, I went to Bint Jbail, I went to Aitashab, and what I saw that I had never seen before was not indiscriminate bombing from the air, but very discriminate and careful destruction from the ground, not during a time of combat. So what had happened in the villages that I visited on that reporting trip nearly, or actually more than a year ago, was the villages had survived intact through the war, and then during the ceasefire, when the residents had left, Israeli troops came in, and they documented this themselves, by the way, right?
Mm.
They're not hiding this. They sort of post videos of them doing this. They went through and dynamited homes, um, destroyed water tanks, ripped up sewage drainage culverts, water pipes, plowed over olive trees. I mean, they went through and very carefully took apart the entire infrastructure of the community and the homes people lived in. And in the case I saw most carefully, this was a Christian village that was comprised of people who did not support Hezbollah. So it was not that that makes it not that this should be a precondition for being spared this kind of dismantling, but this was a village that had carefully stayed out of the fight and had not let Hezbollah fighters come into their village and fire at Israel from there. And it didn't matter. Like they got no extra consideration. They're close to the border. That's the end of that. And sorry, I know I want to be asking you questions, but I really want to make sure our listeners understand this. The language of border and border village does not do justice to what we're talking about. We're talking about these quote unquote villages are communities that look like small cities, where a total of somewhere between 500,000 and a million people live. And these are places that have been continuously inhabited for, if not millennia, certainly centuries. So when we talk about the destruction of the village of Bint Jbail, what people should understand is we're talking about a area that's more densely populated than most American cities, in which people are living in 2 to 5 story buildings made of stone in a village center, quote unquote village center, that's several square miles. So it's like Greenwich Village being
Yes.
completely obliterated. It is not like what people might imagine when they think of a village. It's not 100 farmhouses or low slung ranch houses. This is a city in the hills that's being decimated.
Yeah, no, that's a great way for listeners to visualize the scale of this destruction. And and we also like Gaza, the we have the evidence, we have the track record of, as you said, of Israeli soldiers documenting this destruction themselves, and we also have top Israeli political officials, leaders, military officials, the defense minister Israel Katz, saying that his troops would destroy all houses in Lebanese border villages in accordance with the model used in Rafah and Beit Hanun. I mean, he did this in the lead up to this latest invasion in March. He said it very clearly, and even that didn't move the world. And I think one of the things that Lebanese from the South, and I hear it my relatives and friends and people who have connections to the South, they're having this almost surreal experience that the people of Gaza had for 2.5 years, of feeling, how can the world see this and not react, not lift a finger? I mean, the Lebanese are luckier in some way in that, because of the geography in Lebanon, they had somewhere to run to, they had somewhere to go, other than being moved around 10 different times by the Israeli military in Gaza, and being killed off in a systematic way. So they're being killed off much slower in Lebanon, in compared to Gaza, and compared to the scale of attack scare there. Um, so it's a loss of any potential life in these towns and villages that, as you said, are mini cities and mini neighborhoods. I mean, Bint Jbail has 30, 40,000 residents normally, and that's not counting the summer when population doubles or triples because of many people going back and living there. I was there. I visited last summer. Yeah, and I saw the that scale of destruction. There was significant destruction. It wasn't Israel wasn't as hard hit as Khiam, as Marun al-Ras, and some other places at that point. But there was in especially in places like Marun and Ras, places that abut the border, pretty much are right alongside the border. We had, since the ceasefire, the first iteration of the so-called ceasefire in November of 2024, up until March of 2026, where the Israelis would essentially bomb or drone any bulldozer that tried to lift that tried to enter certain towns, do anything. I mean, someone tried to clear the rubble in their home, that bulldozer would be bombed fairly quickly, and it sent the message very quickly to people that Israel was not going to allow any attempt at reconstruction. And I think that that's now part of the fear, is that even if there is some kind of ceasefire, some kind of Israeli withdrawal, um, that the next plan, or the next Israeli plan and approach will be to just monitor very closely, monitor as they have the capability, they have the technology to do that now without having soldiers on the ground all the time. They can monitor these areas and bomb anyone who tries to rebuild for years to come.
So for the remainder of the time we have, I want to ask you to focus on what could be done and what should be done. You know, you've made repeated reference to the world standing by, and I think you've done a really good job in your writing, uh, precise, precisely showing the ways in which different governments and actors could actually stop this. So, tell us what can and should happen, even if we both are afraid that it won't.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's been clear since the start of this. It's been clear since the early um, response of the Biden administration, that you've written a lot about this. I've written about this. It was fairly clear cut what the Biden administration needed to do, was to cut off the supply of weapons and to cut off political support for Israel, and to say this is it. You have to stop, and to Biden chose not to do that, and he had many excuses, and even went through all these contortions when essentially violating U.S. laws and his own guidelines that he had issued. I guess it was in 2024, early 2024, when he issued that new that national security memorandum that he then later had the State Department and Tony Blinken and others violate. Um, his own policies, on making, and that was on making judgments of whether U.S. weaponry was being used to violate international law and commit war crimes, which basically anyone with a cell phone, anyone with a cell phone and access to the internet could see what's happening in Gaza. But the Biden administration decided to turn a blind eye to that for 15 months. And then you had the same continuing under Trump. The weapons pipeline is as active as ever, and here we've been seeing a lot of the debate in D.C. and policymakers about Israel should buy its own weapons. I mean, that's all well and good. Yes, we also, because there's the added layer of U.S. complicity of the U.S. gifting these weapons to Israel, U.S. taxpayers doing that. But really, I mean, Israel paying for the weapons is a marginal issue. You need to stop the flow of weapons
Right.
to
I mean, they're
as
like, for example, the 300 armored bulldozers that the
Mhm.
U.S. Approved sending two weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. Israel's paying for them; they're not being given for
Mhm.
free, but they can't make these armored bulldozers themselves, and these are clearly being used for the project we're talking about. They're being used to dismantle Lebanon primarily. That's why they need 300 Caterpillar D9 armored bulldozers. So if the U.S. refuses to send them, Israel might still be able to cause harm, but they simply can't do it at the scale, speed, and depth that they're doing it now.
Exactly. And if the U.S. had stopped this flow in back in late 2023, even it would have had a huge. I mean, right? We saw those reports in the Israeli press of um, military officials, retired and serving ones, leaking, saying that they had to preserve bombs, they had to preserve armaments because they were using so many, to bomb Gaza, that they were running out and they weren't being replenished as quickly. So anyone we had a lot of Biden administration officials who contorted themselves to say, oh well, if we stop this, actually this gives us a point of leverage over the Israelis, that we can change their behavior. They'll let a little more aid in. It was ridiculous. It was
It
a
was ridiculous,
ludicrous.
also
Yeah, yeah.
demonstrably untrue,
Yes,
right?
yes. The
Um,
use sort of used.
and I think it's a really I mean it's a really interesting case that gives evidence to something that many of us believe to be true for a long time, that you cannot address these political and even security dilemmas by force. And what's happened in Lebanon, just like Gaza, by the way, but we're focused on Lebanon in this conversation, is really proof of that. After several years of let's say, unprecedented military action against Lebanon and Hezbollah, including things like the pager attacks, which and the assassination of Nasrallah, which Israel and its supporters would hold up as evidence of a great, brilliant military success. None of this violence has successfully deterred or decapitated Hezbollah as a fighting force. So today, South Lebanon is uninhabitable to its many hundreds of thousands of residents, but Hezbollah is still able to fight and fire rockets at Israel. So force can accomplish ethnic cleansing. It cannot actually accomplish eliminating as a fighting force a group that is determined to continue fighting, which just goes to show. I mean, I can't peer into the motives of the Israeli campaign, but we can certainly see the results. The results are it accomplishes one thing very successfully, depopulating civilian communities. It does not accomplish this other stated goal, which is to put Hezbollah on its back foot or eliminate it as a security challenge to Israel.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, so even this level of unprecedented destruction is doesn't actually help Israel achieve its stated goals, just to sort of neutralize Hezbollah and return residents of northern Israel to their communities. Um, now we're seeing the Hezbollah deploying these FPV drones, the one pioneered in Russia and Ukraine by Russia and Ukraine in that war. These drones that are very hard to shoot down, that are very hard to interfere with, and the Israeli military is wondering what to do every day about that because they have soldiers who are sitting targets for these drones, and they have in northern Israel they have communities that can be targets. So all of this destruction hasn't um, led to what ultimately needs to happen. And you've been writing this, I've been writing this as a political settlement. You can't get anywhere um, without that political settlement, and that got lost. The Biden administration totally lost track of that. The Trump administration isn't
Not even
thinking
interested in
about
it.
that. Yeah, it's not interested in
Well,
interested in
so
the
can these
show force.
ambassador level talks between Israel and Lebanon, which are noteworthy in being the first direct talks between these two governments, if I understand correctly, since 1948, uh, are these plausibly going to lead to that political settlement that you and I hope to see someday?
It's hard to see that happening, partly because the Lebanese state has so little leverage in these negotiations, and frankly, and Israel isn't really interested in a real political settlement. The Netanyahu government doesn't actually really want a settlement. We've seen that repeatedly in Gaza. We've seen it elsewhere. We've seen it in Iran and Syria. It's this perpetual, endless war keeps Netanyahu in power, keeps his allies happy, and it keeps the machinery of the state always in this perpetual emergency, in this perpetual war making, war footing, and delays certainly any reckoning that Netanyahu might face for October 2023 for his personal corruption trial for on all of those levels, but also keeps the Israeli society engaged in this um, perpetual endless war, and will open up this next question, which is how long can that society maintain this war footing? You had the U.S. was exhausted after some years of this, and the U.S. is a much larger and more powerful economy and doesn't isn't dependent on a imperial power to keep it in place, or at least to keep its war machinery running. So, how long can Israeli society maintain this footing? I don't know the answer to that question, but Israelis are going to have to reckon with that question pretty soon, I think.
Well, and the flip side of that is that Lebanese resilience means that Lebanon, fortunately or unfortunately, can survive wave after wave of like unconscionable and unbelievable violence, and that's, I think, the not the subtext, but the implication of the story, the history, personal and national, that you began this conversation with, is a reminder that, I mean, the people of South Lebanon have been expelled, have returned, have had their communities destroyed, have lived under occupation, have been penetrated by collaborationists and subjected to what at the time was considered shocking patterns of torture and detention, things that today are normalized, but in the 80s and 90s were considered shocking. And they've come back and rebuilt again and again. So, uh, one of my not fears, but I guess observations, is that this kind of human resilience has made it seem feasible, right, for a state like Israel or a government like the United States to say, "Oh, let's see what happens. Let's see what happens if we subject this." I mean, look what Syria has survived. Look what Iraq has survived. Look what Yemen has survived. Like, is it really so bad? And of course, for those of us who spend any time in these places, yes, it absolutely is so bad and worse. It's worse than you can imagine. But because people survive, it's almost as if not everybody dies, it's therefore like an acceptable equilibrium.
Yeah, that's a great observation. That's a great way of framing it, and I think that gets us back to the beginning of our conversation, that is part of the root of this numbness that we're seeing from the West, and this um, sense of this way of obscuring the scale of devastation of human suffering that's happening on a daily basis, and that I think ultimately that can only lead to catastrophe, right? Sort of we've seen it, and this in a kind of catastrophe that we're probably not anticipating right now, because we've seen this cycle repeat itself so many times.
I mean, Hezbollah exists as a response to a previous era of Israeli invasion and occupation, and the sort of point and counterpoint. I mean, I see in both Lebanese and Israeli society a mirroring among the extremists in both societies, as they find a deeper and deeper raison d'être in their like unresolvable struggle with one another. And like the rest of society, at least in Lebanon's case, is like, hey, we're not part of this, but we're completely implicated in this, and it's, it only becomes our fight because of what is done to us in the name of someone else's joint struggle. Can we end, Mohammed, by you telling us a little bit about where your extended family is now, and this summer where you'll be able to plan to visit, if not your family home in Bint Jbail?
Yeah, so my family is spread out. Some are in different parts of Beirut. Some are in the mountains, in different communities. Some are, some are staying with friends. Some are staying with extended relatives. Some are staying in the apartments and homes of other relatives who live abroad and who opened up their homes to them. I mean, that's one of the strengths of that society, is the familial and kinship, and those bonds are extremely important. And the state hasn't been very effective at handling the influx of displaced people. Unlike in Israel, which, thanks to its socialist model of government, helped in part by that U.S. taxpayer support, it's able to provide very clear-cut services the Israelis displaced. I mean, we're talking about much smaller numbers in Israel than in Lebanon. But yes, Lebanese state hasn't been able to provide that kind of support. But so people are forced to rely on family ties and kinship and extended communities. And I'm hoping I'm planning to go to at least Beirut this summer and to see some of my relatives and be able to reconnect with them. I doubt I'll be able to go to Bint Jbail or get anywhere close to it. Uh, you know, and that and that's going to be heartbreaking in a different way to be close but yet not be able to go. But that's an experience, you know, I've had and other family members have had for a long time. So during the extended occupation from 78 to 2000, many of us couldn't go to Bint Jbail. I mean, I was then of a recruitable age. I could have been, if I had gone, I could possibly have been recruited. If I gone on visits to Lebanon, I could possibly have been recruited into the SLA, into the South Lebanon Army. So
So in
there's a
order
risk
to
people.
protect yourself from that, you had to stay away. Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
it's so sad to see this piece of the history repeating itself. And I mean, I remember the passionate intensity with which people cultivated their homes and their plantings in the South uh, in the era in which I was able to travel there, and they were very acutely aware of that 22-year window when they could not visit. Right. And they came
Mhm.
back and found their homes in ruins and replanted their orchards or, prune the trees to bring them back to life and so on. And it's both shocking and also shockingly predictable that it's happening again. You've been listening to Order from Ashes. I've been talking to Mohamad Bazzi. He's director of the Hagup Kevorkian Center at New York University. He also writes regularly for The Guardian. And the trigger for our discussion today was his beautiful and heartbreaking essay, Is This What War Looks Like Now? In The Guardian. You'll be able to find the link to that in the show notes. Mohammed, thank you so much for coming on Order from Ashes.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Thanassis Cambanis. See you here on the podcast again next week. Thanks for listening.